Welcome to the Grow Your Practice podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Chad Madden, owner of Madden Physical Therapy and Breakthrough. Join me each week as we dive into the best practices, systems, principles, tips, and tricks to help you grow your private practice.
Hey everybody, Chad Madden here with the Grow Your Practice podcast. And today we have a very special guest and familiar face. Bob, I think you're a four-timer now here on the Grow Your Practice podcast. But it's, Bob Kowalick with RCS, Revenue Cycle Solutions. He's a physical therapist, private practice owner, father of physical therapist, husband to a physical therapist. It knows private practice inside and out, has a lot of data, a lot of new stuff for us to look at. So welcome to the podcast here, Bob.
Thank you, Chad. I appreciate it very much. And it's a pleasure to be here as always. And also a father-in-law to physical therapist, so we don't want to leave that one out.
Wow, that's great. Pretty widespread there. So for listeners that haven't heard your story before, Bob, can you just take a second and talk about, your career as a physical therapist and also what you did, because you had an amazing journey there as a private practice owner, very successful. Before we get into the billing and revenue cycle conversation, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I worked for a hospital system for about 7 years and then went off on my own and started a practice and hired my first employee. I opened with one employee plus myself, and we were outpatient ortho and sports medicine, as many are, and we just did it right. We were very focused on outcome and service and all that, and so we grew to about 10,000 visits a month in about a 4 to 5 year time frame. And so then I kind of rode that out for a while and ended up selling to one of the big consolidators at the time. Ended up through just a series of kind of unforeseen events, right? I didn't have a master plan to go into the revenue cycle management business. And at the time, we just called it billing, right? Medical billing. And there is an important distinction between medical billing and revenue cycle management. I mean, billing is a piece of revenue cycle management, right? So, I sold, and I was the only owner. Felt pretty guilty about selling and having all my billing staff. We did billing in-house. I had 7 or 8 billers on staff at the time, and felt guilty. They were all going to lose their job because I sold the company, right? So one thing led to another. Ended up spinning off my billing department into a standalone company, and that's evolved into what we're doing today. So started off originally, all we did for the first couple of years was collect accounts receivables for acquired practices. So if the seller acquired the AR, we were converting the AR to cash for the seller. If the buyer acquired the AR, we were converting AR to cash for the buyer. And then over time expanded to full service. And we've had just a nonstop evolutionary process really ever since then. So we've gone from focused on, billing to using billing as a business intelligence tool, and happy to talk all about that as we go through the podcast.
Awesome. So, and thanks for touching base on the introduction. I'll probably ask you about Navy SEALs here at the very end for fun.
Okay.
Can you give people some idea around the scope of, because I think that most people don't understand how many practices you work with, because this is more than 4 or 5 other practices that you're helping with revenue cycle solution, and also like you have a pretty big staff right now of 30 or 40 plus, but I'm not sure the exact number, but can you give people an idea of the size of the scope of the data that you're looking at when to set up, as we're talking about the data as a BI tool?
Sure. We have a wide range of practices from small, one location, single practitioner offices up to, 5,000 visits a month type practices with multiple locations. So we're in total, working with about 250 or so different offices, different clinics. And that's across about 75 or so different practices. And we have somewhere between 50 and 60 FTEs doing billing right now.
Well, that's a lot. Yeah. So working with a lot of practices, a ton of data. I know you mentioned data as the BI tool, and just to clarify for everybody, that stands for business information, correct? Or business intelligence.
Business intelligence, yeah. It is all information.
Right. So can you talk about how the most recent evolution about how a few years ago, you and I were talking a lot about ADO score, and now there seems to be a heavier focus on time and billing time, especially when a big pain point for most of us as owners is we feel like we're doing more and more work for less and less money at a higher business cost. Our margins are shrinking dramatically, and we can talk about that. But that some insurance companies we're spending a lot more money to collect a dollar from than other insurance companies. So can you talk about that last step in the evolution from ADO score over to the business intelligence?
Yeah. So if I can, a little bit of context on the reasons behind, right? The why behind the what. I still think like a physical therapist, right? All you great physical therapists out there, you don't look at a patient and go, oh, you got back pain. I know everything there is to know, right? You do the deep dive into the why, right? You try to really figure out why things happen. And I can't shut that part of my brain off. So I've approached this billing and revenue cycle management, business, and with that, with that kind of thing driving my thought process. So the fundamental business problem that I have, or had, and still have to lesser extent, but still have, was the amount of time that it took to do physical therapy billing from one practice to another had a variance on a per unit of measure. And so let's just call one visit equals one claim for conversation. And I know that there's scenarios out there with UBO4 billing where you might bill multiple dates in one claim form, but let's just, for a conversation, say that the vast majority of the industry's billing, a visit equals a claim. So we look at the world in terms of visits, right? So, and that's visits treated, not scheduled. So per visit, or per certain number of visits, the amount of time investment that we were putting in to create a constant outcome had a variance of 1,000%. So that's 10x. And you scratch your head, you go, how is that even possible? Literally, it's like if you were, going to treat your next patient yet, and you didn't know if you were going to spend 30 minutes or 300 with that patient. It's kind of crazy that could be true, but it is true. And so another important thing to keep in mind about how we approach this from the beginning, as crazy as this might sound, I didn't care in the beginning that I made money doing billing. I went into the billing business because I wanted to save jobs, right? So I had one constant, one policy, whatever you want to call it. And that was, we're going to do whatever it takes in terms of time to produce the outcome that is needed. We want to collect all the money that's available as quickly as possible. And I did not care what it took in terms of time in order to produce that outcome. So that put me in a very interesting position that's proven today to be the very reason why I can speak to the things that I can today. Because if I artificially controlled time, and this is what happens throughout the industry, is time is a constant. You got an FTE or two, or you outsource billing to somebody that is a fixed percent of revenue, and they create a time budget and they essentially ration time. And so where most of the billing world has been forever is they directly control time, and outcome becomes a variable, right? I approached it where I wanted the outcome to be a constant and the time to be a variable. And that fundamentally put me in over time in a little different place. I didn't know at the time what I know today. I didn't see that, 10 years out. But as this evolved, because we were in that structure, I was able to experience something as amazing as 1,000% time variance from, one, practice to another, and ask the question, why? What the heck? Why could that be true? What are the things about this practice versus this practice that cause us to have to spend so much more time to get some similarity in outcome? And so we've been focused on now for years explaining the time variance. And the biggest driver of all is what I call revenue cycle complexity. There's a claim is not a claim. Some claims are very difficult to get paid. Some claims are broken and they require a whole bunch more time, right? Some are very clean and they just go from claim submission to payment. And so there's many variables that determine the complexity of converting your claims, into cash. And let me just introduce another concept here that, simplifies kind of the way that I, view this whole thing. What physical therapists do with their time is convert time into modifiers, CPTs, and units and documentation. And that all of that goes into that. Your coding, your units, your modifiers, your AMA versus CMS rules, all the things, your schedule structures, all this stuff is part of the process of converting time into potential revenue. Revenue cycle management is all about then converting potential revenue into cash. And there's many, many things that happen along the way that create a lot more complexity in that process of converting potential revenue to cash. Some of them are caused by the things that happen in creating potential revenue. Some of it is related to your systems that you work in, the software. They're not all created equal. The clearinghouse that you use, the quality at which you're able to control and do accurate patient registration and data entry, and making sure that credentialing's in order and authorization management happens, and verification of benefits is capturing all the information. And there's many, many things about all the practice as a whole that are all revenue cycle functions that ultimately will determine how easy or difficult it is to get paid. And that's where the huge variance lied, and in large part was in the practice operations execution on all the things that determined whether a claim was going to be easy or very difficult or even impossible, to collect on. The other big piece of the puzzle is your payer mix. As you know, and you've already mentioned this, Chad, that the complexity from the payers is going up quite a lot, right? Medicare Advantage plans are harder to get paid by than Medicare. Medicaid HMOs are harder to get paid by than straight Medicaid. Commercial insurances, that pay on a fee schedule versus a fixed, per diem rate. There's huge variance in the amount of complexity that comes from the payer. And so I believe that today private practice owners need to understand their practice in the context of the complexity around getting paid, because the cost to get paid, that escalation in cost, is directly related to the complexity that's created. Some of it controllable and preventable, and some of it structural and just kind of the way it is. And having that understanding is what's super important, to understand your cost, your time. It is all about time. And so managing revenue cycle is all about creating balance between the time it takes to get your billing done to produce the outcome you want and the supply of that time. And if you're out of whack, if your demand is way higher than your supply, bless you, that's where the problems come in. The AR accumulates, and the amount of time it takes to clean up old AR is 3 to 5 times the time it takes to keep AR clean. So there's so many variables that we've discovered over time that drove that 10x variance in time per visit And we've just come up with ways as we've continued to evolve to really quantify those things and understand those things. And now we're heading down the path of trying to help clients actually fix those things. So that was the big evolutionary need, was to really understand the drivers of time.
Great. So I want to walk through just a real life example, hypothetical, but so if we had two practices, and so practice A, they see 100 visits a week, right? Maybe two full-time clinicians. So let's call it 430 visits a month, and they're doing all the revenue cycle management with 20 hours per week, or if we multiply that by 4.3, it's roughly 86 hours. So a half a full-time equivalent. Practice B is also seeing the 430 a month, 100 visits a week. But with your 1,000% variance, they might actually not need 86 hours or a half of a full-time equivalent in billing. They might actually need 5 FTEs or 860 hours a month of billing for the same exact number of visits. So in the example of the variance, is that what you're saying?
Yes. Normalized down to a per claim basis, the average time investment could be that different. Now, what you need to understand is, well, what percentage of all the claims that are in play, right, that are in the process of converting from potential revenue to cash, actually have issues that take time, right? So where that variance comes in is we have had clients and have clients to this day that nearly 100% of their claims have something wrong with it that needs to be fixed. Now, contrast that to somebody that's only true for on 5% of your claims, right? So that is where this huge time variance comes, is in the things that create difficulties and problems for the claim so that it can't go straight from claim submission to payment. The other variable, which is a little more difficult to understand, is the payer mix. So if you think of the worst payer you have, whoever that is, right? And imagine if 70% of your visits were that payer, right? So think about how that would impact the time that it would take to get your billing done. They tell you don't need an authorization, but you do. And so now you've got to go through and prove that you were told that you didn't need an auth, and essentially build the case and then get a retro, auth. And so now you're investing hours to get claims paid, whereas it should have just happened, right? So that combination of practice grown issues and payers bringing their complexity to the table, depending upon the percentage of all the claims that are affected by these things, has the ability to have that much variance from one time to another. And in fact, let me just throw another point here, because I've been trying to get to this for years. You can't even know if your biller is a productive, efficient biller or not without understanding and normalizing for the condition that the biller works in. Right. So if the biller is in this condition of needing to fix a lot of things and needing to deal with a high percentage of claims that are from payers, with payers that are complicated to work with, you can't even know what that efficiency of that biller could be under a very smooth, more organized, more structured, more predictable condition. So it becomes very difficult to even go down the path of things like motivating your biller, incentivizing, creating performance pay, programs, because the worst thing you can do, in my opinion, for performance pay is put subject somebody to things that are out of their control, right? And there's a lot about billing that's out of the biller's control.
A lot of directions we could go here. So I want to make sure that within the context of what you see happening right now in private practice, I know back, I'm going to guess it was 2018, 2019, when you and I spoke, I believe the industry average for private practice PT, the average margin was 14.6%. We've had the pandemic, right? We've had reduction in physician fee schedule. We have increased costs of doing business today. As an industry, where are we at today in terms of margin, average margin?
Yeah, I think we're still in that same range because since then, revenue per visits, if your revenue per visit is entirely based on the payers change over time, revenue per visits are down, 10, 12%. So if you have an adjusted cost with that, that kind of change in, downward pressure in revenue per visit can almost, eliminate margin entirely, right? So I think this is what's driving, practice owners to think about contracting and how should they change payer mix, maybe go out of network with certain payers that pay low amounts and all that. So there's a lot of transitional things going on that are having some success at keeping that revenue per visit closer to where it used to be, but the degree to which you can control all these variables ultimately determines where you're at. Short of major structural payer mix change, okay, just put that aside for a second. Working in the system, in network, taking what payers are paying, about the best that I'm seeing is over the past 5 years, still maintaining about 96, 97% of revenue. And that's with optimizing coding and other things like that. Now
so that's a 3 or 4% reduction.
Yeah. But that's for practices that are doing a really good job at holding up and propping up things that they can, right? Now, for practices that can go through structural evolution and change payer mixes and properly select payers to go out of network and change a $50 payer into a $100 visit scenario, there's more. There's examples of practices that have been able to actually raise revenue per visit over the past 5 years. So, and in the context of what we're talking about here, controlling this revenue cycle complexity, I believe, is the biggest opportunity of all to keep revenue as high as it can be. I want to introduce a concept of revenue per visit ceiling, right? It's based on your structure, it's the most you can expect to get. It's based on a lot of structural variables, your payer mix, your schedule, what you code, right? Are you using AMA time-based roll-up versus CMS so there's lots of variables that determine the maximum potential revenue, right? And so that maximum potential revenue is your revenue per visit ceiling or your revenue limit, right? And the objective number one for revenue cycle is get 100% of whatever that number is. If you're scheduling, if you're billing out, 2 units a visit because you've got a 30-minute appointment, or 2 point something units or something close to 3, your revenue per visit can't be as high as somebody with a 60-minute appointment, right? But so there's optimization. I'm not saying 60 minutes is the way to go. In fact, I believe that, and we've talked about this, that somewhere around that
38.
Yeah, with 38 for federal and 40 for commercial, right? Or non-federal. So somewhere in that 40-minute range is the optimal schedule structure for producing revenue per FTE. Not necessarily revenue per visit, but revenue per FTE. So, we could talk more about that if you'd like, but that's an example of a structural limiter, right? So you have to understand the revenue that's available based on your structure. Then your revenue cycle, converting potential revenue to cash. The objective is convert all that money to cash as quickly as possible. Shortest time in AR, right? And this is where the ADO score thing comes in. You have to know what short in AR is. You have to understand your payer mix. You have to understand that, well, based on,
For people that don't know what ADO is, can you briefly explain what that stands for, and if they haven't heard that before?
Yeah, ADO, average days outstanding. There's some different terms out there like DSO, and but it basically all means how long on average is it taking you to get paid, from the date of service to the date of payment posting. Right?
So May 1st, I deliver the service. May 30th, I get paid. That's 30 days.
30 days, right?
20, whatever. Yeah.
And if you throw out there to all the, the industry experts, well, what's good? They'll throw out numbers that mean absolutely nothing. 30 days, really good. 40 days. It's meaningless out of the context of, well, what's your payer mix? Y'all probably have payers that pay you in 10 days. What if 100% of your visits were that payer? Would 30 days be good? No, it would be awful. It would be 3 times as long as it should be, right? It would be a 300% ADO score. So you don't have single payers. You have a mix of a whole bunch of different kinds of payers. And so part of your data picture for your practice needs to be understanding your payer mix in the context of how long that payer mix on average should take to get paid. We average nationally about 24 days. And so it doesn't mean we don't have a 40-day client, or, we have 12-day clients, right? So, it's all over the map based on the payer mix. But so you have to, kind of understand the metrics and the data in the context of payer mix. I think is one of the biggest drivers of what goes on in a practice. It determines your potential revenue, right? It determines the complexity of getting paid. It determines how many visits you're going to get, right? So the combination of visits and revenue per visit determines what the gross value of a patient is to the practice. If you're averaging $100 a visit and you get 10 visits, that's $1,000 gross value of a new patient. But if you only get 5 visits, it's $500. Right? If you're getting $60 in 5 visits, it's $300. And we see that kind of variance in what that gross value of a new patient, gross meaning there's no cost applied to it yet, right? So all these complexity variables impact ultimately what the revenue is going to be. I want you to think in the context of, if something is happening with your claims that's causing your biller to have to spend a lot more time than they should have, if that thing didn't happen, then that is a revenue risk. Inefficiencies, time inflators, things that inflate the time of the billing process, all are revenue risks to the practice, either in terms of amount or timing. They're 2 sides of the same coin. We track 250 different ways that this happens. Okay, I could tell you 250 of them, but pick one. We'll use the example we already said. You were told you didn't need an authorization, and so you didn't get one, and it turns out you get your first visit processed, and it comes back denied for no auth. That's a payer error. Different than your verification of benefits process didn't determine that an authorization was needed, and so one was not obtained. Now, try to get those 8 to 10 visits paid that you've already treated before you got your first claim back, right? Your first EOB or ERA back. So the point is that there's so many things that slow down revenue, that put revenue at risk, decrease the amounts and they're all inflators in the billing process in terms of billing time, that there's tremendous opportunity to keep that revenue per visit up, keep, at the top of that, what the ceiling is. And it's a pretty it's a pretty underutilized strategy. Everyone's focused on, and I'm not saying don't focus on these things, but, asking for money, contracting, those things. But what I think is ideal is that your operations are producing 100% of the structural revenue that's available as quickly as possible. And if under that condition, your margin is still too low, then your costs are either too high, or you have to look at a change in your structure. You need to change that payer mix. You need to change the things that determine what the ceiling is. And so it's a kind of complicated, but you have to really understand the condition, and understanding condition is all about data.
Yeah. A lot of questions for you on data. Before we get there, I just want to be clear. So 2019, 14.6% margin. I thought I heard you say here that it was similar. That's for the practices you're working with, but there has been a 4% decrease in revenue. I'll say this empirically. I've talked with more owners than ever before within the last 6 months to a year that are 10% or lower in margin. We're talking with Greg Crabtree. This is probably now 5, 6, 7 years ago. He had said, that's kind of the Mendoza line, that anytime you dip below 10% margin in a service-based business, you're skating on very thin ice. And it's universal. It's not just a physical therapy, any service-based business, regardless of size. He said, you're playing with fire a little bit, or any other analogy that you want to use. If the average is still in that 14, 15% range, are you seeing more practices in jeopardy than ever before we won't get into fear mongering or anything like that, Bob?
Well, yeah, and understand too that, as my role with the practices that we service is not to understand the cost side, right? We're a revenue side view of the world, right? So I can tell you what's happened with revenue per visit, with payers driving reimbursement levels down. Medicare's cut 3% per year for 3 years in a row, right? So, but we don't normally get into the cost side of operations. Now, I happen to have some visibility into that because I do work with some practice owners that we don't do revenue cycle for, and work with them in the context of trying to maximize the value of their practice, increase, scalability, things like that. So I do have some visibility into it, and it's all over the map. I know of practices that are very large, 8,000-10,000 visits a month, that make no money, and practices that are 2,000 visits a month running at 20% margins. So it's all points in between. And a lot of it, so much of it depends on your demographic, where the practice is located. The demographic location drives a lot of your payer mix, right? You guys are the marketing experts about how you try and feed your practice, new business. But there's a financial quality to new patients, right? And so where you are and all that kind of stuff is important in determining that. But I think that revenue per visits, outside of really good strategies to keep revenue per visit up, are probably down closer to 10%. And the variance in the market has to do with how well practice owners are doing with implementing things that can keep it up. What I want to suggest is that every practice, a constant should be you're getting everything on the table as quickly as possible. Without that condition, other things become more blurry, right? It's hard to know what you need to ask from a payer if you're leaving money on the table and your margin is really low because you're not converting all your potential revenue to cash, right? Or if it's taking you 60 days instead of 20. Right. And there's a lot of cost in that. So I'm a big believer in knowing conditions and making condition-based decisions, right? And the conditions are defined by data. And so you want to create the best conditions you can for the structures that you have. And if that's not giving you what you need in terms of margin, then it's the structure that needs to be changed. But if you're operationally leaving a lot of money on the table, to go about changing structure is kind of risky because you're doing it without total clarity about what you really have and what you really need.
Got it. Are you a practice owner with a growth mindset? You're looking to grow your revenues, leave a bigger impact, build a legacy, and help more people in your practice, yet at the same time, you're dealing with the big challenges and headwinds like declining reimbursements, increased cost of doing business because of inflation, how to incentivize your staff, or deciding where's the best place to run your online ads. Growing a practice can be absolutely overwhelming. To help, Breakthrough has put together a unique offer that I think you'll be interested in. For a limited time, listeners of this podcast can schedule a risk-free growth consultation with a breakthrough growth expert. On that call, you'll walk through what you're currently doing in your practice and what you could be doing to increase the demand for your services. Breakthrough's mission is to help people overcome their health challenges naturally. And the best way for them to do that is by helping private practice owners just like you through building more demand for your services. Go to breakthrough.com/podcast offer to take advantage of this unique opportunity. On that call, you'll learn the key principles of how practice owners are helping more people, creating a bigger impact, and building better businesses with Breakthrough systems. As an added bonus, the team at Breakthrough is giving a $50 Amazon gift card to any of the podcast listeners who attend the growth consultation. Sign up for your growth consultation and $50 gift card at getbreakthrough.com/podcast offer. Again, that's getbreakthrough.com/podcast offer. Going to Bob University for the last few years, I wrote down the evolution as I saw it, and I just wanted to know if I missed anything. So I think the first thing that we ever talked about, likely on a podcast episode, and I know on frequent calls with owners, was the ADO and payer mix concept. That seemed to be at least the biggest fire, the most emphasis in how owners were leaving money on the table at the time. Then I think there was an evolution to AR time, which was this idea of balance between how much time we're spending collecting AR versus time actually reclaim. Yeah. If you can talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah. Does the time investment for AR match the condition of the AR?
Yeah.
Right. So where we started was we really wanted to define the what, right? Make sure we had an accurate understanding of the levels of things, define the condition in terms of, ADO score is a relative metric. And that's an important thing to grab onto is there's so much more value in relative metrics than just isolated data points, right? My average time in AR is 25 days. My expected time in AR based on my payer mix is 25 days. Now you know that 25 days is a good number, right? My average time in AR is 30 days, but my expected time in AR is 20 days. Not so good, right? So because there's a difference, a relative difference between actual and what it should be. And so understanding the condition. So when we were looking at constantly seeing ADO scores in the market over 200%, meaning it's taking twice as long as it should to get paid. And we were able to translate that into revenue per visit loss over a period of time, because as we moved revenue ADO scores back to 100%, we saw revenue per visits go up. And we knew there's a correlation between the two. But the evolutionary step has been in explaining why the 200% ADO score exists. Not just measuring that that's what it is, but really understanding the drivers that cause AR to get inflated. And you cannot just look at an inflated AR and equate that with a biller that's not doing their job, because it is way more complicated than that. All these complexity factors. In fact, it could be nothing. It could have nothing to do with your biller. It could have everything to do with your biller. You have to know the difference, right? So I'm sure you could give with the 27 kids you have, Chad. You could you could give examples. Relate that to kids. You have to look at it. How are they functioning in the reality that they exist in, right? And so the billing process is affected by all the other things that go on outside of billing. That's what revenue cycle is. That's why we talk revenue cycle today and not billing, because billing is just one function of many in revenue cycle. Your clinical documentation is revenue cycle. Your verification of benefits is revenue cycle. Your eligibility, your enrollments with payers, your credentialing, your authorization management. These are all functions that happen in every practice, unless you're 100% cash. Then you're like a sane business, right? Like, you're like normal businesses. You do something and you get paid for it. Well, that's not healthcare, right? So,
then there's other problems.
Yeah. So, all of those things directly affect the time it takes to get billing done. And that's why what we've done is said, you know what, since that's true, and we know that that's true, we should be using billing, the time investment in billing, in reverse to understand how all the things are working. And so your biller, I can tell you, whether you're outsourced or in-house, your biller is directly affected by how every other function in your practice works. And so we've just gone down the path of really quantifying how much, to what extent, where is the source of these things.
Can you talk more about so when you were here in Harrisburg, we were talking about the data project that you're working on, and business intelligence specifically about it. So and by the way, I want to go back to my cliff notes. So it was ADO payer mix. The next big thing that I think we emphasized was AR and the time spent there. And then the most recent is the business intelligence and really focusing on mistakes or errors that are the biller's responsibility or not, and the time delay that is happening with that. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes, it's totally accurate.
Okay. So latest project that you're working on.
Yeah, latest project is, so we've now, because there's so much that happens, there's so much sources of complexity, structural and operational. We're trying to break all this down and understand all of them, right? I equate revenue cycle complexity, and I wrote a series of 3 articles in Impact last fall, August, September, October.
We'll link that out for everybody in the show notes, just for the record.
Okay. But I equate revenue cycle complexity with the black hole. And I'm weird, and I read quantum physics and stuff, and I try to understand stuff like black holes. And it's really interesting because black holes are out there, they're everywhere, they affect everything, they create galaxies, they do all this stuff, right? And
you're eccentric, Bob. You're not weird. Yeah.
You can't see them. Like, they just literally in the last year photographed the first black hole ever, right? And so they're there. They affect everything, but they're very mysterious and hard to quantify. And that's what revenue cycle complexity is. It is there. It is real. It is affecting your practice. The only question is it a tiny little black hole or a huge supermassive black hole? Is it really wreaking havoc with things, or is it just a little nuisance? Right. So you have to understand this. So what we've done is we've built a platform that all of our billing team is in all day long. And every time they encounter something that causes them to have to now go in different directions, take a turn, take a U-turn, stop, spend more time, they quantify that. It's a 3 to 5 second process to quantify it. It's a 3-click hierarchy. It allows us to capture about 250 different scenarios. Click, click, click. That affected 1 claim. That affected 5 claims. They're done. That's the time investment. And now we've captured data about what caused the biller to have to spend more time. And we've built this thing in a way that we relate the issue back to the source problem. Was it a patient registration problem? Was it a clinical documentation problem? Is it a credentialing problem, an auth problem, right? So what kind of the nature of it? Where does it come from? And the 3 clicks takes us from high level understanding, like we were missing information, which is different than we're dealing with incorrect information, right? That's just one example. Got about 9 big picture kinds of things. Each thing has sub-levels to it, and each sub-level has a detail level to it. So 3 clicks takes us down to a description like missing insurance information. It was the member ID. We now know exactly what the problem was. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, we've captured that. So they do this all day long. And so what we've been able to do is put together a profile of what a normal practice actually looks like in terms of issues that are created from a time inflation standpoint in billing. And we're now relating that back to how much revenue is held up, how much revenue is put at risk. If this problem isn't fixed, what's the cost, not only in terms of labor, but in terms of lost or delayed revenue. And so we're really building out this database of to explain this complexity, black hole. We're also now adding individual payer issues, right? So where we started, we just had a category of payer error, authorization, misinformation, click, click, click. Now we're saying payer error. Oh, UHC, Aetna, right? We're building a database now for every specific payer in terms of how many errors do the payers make, which will be very interesting. So you might want to have me again before I get, taken out, or before I'm in a position to go public with that. But
do you have any climbing trips coming up here mountaineering trips that I should know about?
No. I'm going up. It's the coming down. The knees talk to me a little too much now. So I'm gonna have to learn to fly off. Then I could be back in the game. But anyway, so we're quantifying all these things, and we know that. So I'll give you a snapshot of all the data. So in about the last 16 to 17 months, we've collected this data on almost 1 million claims now. So that's a pretty good data set. 68% of all issues that we encounter, and we define issue as it's a time inflator for the biller, and it's a revenue risk for the practice. Revenue risks are two types: amount of money, timing of getting paid. Okay, 68% on this 1 million claim study, the problems were caused internal to the practice. All those revenue cycle functions I've mentioned a few times. 23% of all of the problems are created by the payer. What's interesting about payer-generated problems compared to practice-generated problems is that the average payer problem takes 334% of the time to fix as the average practice-caused problem. So the volume of payer problems is actually only 8%, but the time investment, the time cost is actually 23% because they're much more expensive in terms of time per problem. The other 9% are your systems, differences and efficiencies of the softwares that are in use, the clearinghouses that are in use. And so to me, that's a problem, right? We look at our industry and we look at these variables like decreased reimbursement, tight margins. That creates a lot of stress, right? Should I sell? Should I try to stay? Right? What do I do? How do I become more scalable and stable and all this kind of stuff? 68% of the complexity that's created comes from inside the practice. So to me, that's tremendous opportunity for improvement. It just has to start with understanding what's the nature and the volume and the frequency and the severity of the problems that I have. And that's what we're quantifying. So
how does an owner learn more? How do they get in contact with you? How do they take a look at what you're doing and really learn more about putting this in their practice?
Yeah, so the best email to get me at is my revenue cycle management company, Robert at certifiedrsllc.com. That's an evolution, right? We used to be called Certified Reimbursement Solutions. Now we're Revenue Cycle Solutions, right? So we just changed our name, but my email's still attached to the old name. So certifiedrsllc.com. We have, and if I'm allowed to kind of say what we're doing in terms of how we're helping practices.
Please do, yes.
So if you use us to do your billing, right? All this data, all this stuff, all the use of this platform is all part of how we do the billing. Because we now look at doing billing. Getting the billing task done is as important as it's ever been, but it's now secondary to using billing to create data that can be used to improve the practice, right? And I could share a case study if you'd like about how powerful that could be when it really is.
Yep.
Before I hit that, so that's one option. The other option, which makes this kind of unique, is personally, I'm not here to try to convince everybody to outsource their billing, right? But I believe that billing should be done the way that we do it. And so the platform will be coming online and available to practices that do their own billing, that want to convert their billing people into BI tools to generate this data. You could do it the same way that we do it. So that's something that's on the horizon here, not too far off. So if you're interested in either scenario, if you're interested in data, just reach out. So quick case study, 4 years evolution with a practice. And this is not an isolated incident, right? 4 years ago, 2,200 visits a month, $85 a visit. Their incidence rates of problems created per 100 visits per month. So we're normalizing this in that way so that we can compare big practices to little practices. So their incidence rates were 30 per 100. So a 30% problem rate, claim break rate, whatever you want to call it. Okay. 2,200 visits a month, $85 a visit, 30% problem rate. Today, 5,000 visits a month, $102 a visit, 5% problem rate. There's a correlation there. The revenue per visit change and the and a couple other pieces of information. Billing efficiency almost doubled, and the cost of billing down 40%. So that you combine all that together, you could do the quick math if you want. You got a calculator handy, but take 5,000 visits a month, multiply it by $17 a visit, about 960 grand in revenue. And when you make these kinds of changes, right, 100% of that is profit. It doesn't cost you any more to get paid 102 than it did to get paid 85. You're still doing all the same things. Now, it will actually cost you less because there's less problems, less fires to put out. The cost of your billing operation should go down as the revenue goes up. And that's how we're structured. So we're outcome based, right? So we want to incentivize and motivate alignment and being on the same side of the fence and problem solving and collaboration. So the major change in the practice was they went from 30% claim break to 5% claim break. Revenue goes up, cost goes down, and you add all that together and apply a 7x multiple, you're talking about a $7 million practice valuation difference, right? So it is a very, very good strategy place to focus on improving, and I can help you do it. Either way, I'm on both sides of the fence now. Not trying to talk you into outsourcing. If you want to keep it in-house, I can help you with that.
Great. So Robert at certifiedrsllc.com. We'll make sure we have your email, your best email here in the show notes. And then we'll also, the PDF that you gave for the black hole feeding off your practice. I love the articles. We'll make sure that's included in the show notes as well.
Yeah. And if you wouldn't mind, if you do reach out through email in the subject line, if you could put, Grow Your Practice Podcast with Chad, that would be awesome.
Nice. The other, so final question for you. Most influential book in your life that changed your thought process and life trajectory?
Okay, you're catching me Yeah, I have to think.
That's the purpose. That's the purpose of the question, Bob.
The most influential book. Boy, I am totally blanking out here.
Do you have a book that you've read multiple times and gone back to?
Yeah, I read Scale many times, the book by a guy named David Finkel. I read Scaling Up many times by Vern Harnish.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say those from a business, perspective. I read some off the wall stuff. I love some of Stephen Hawking's stuff. I read everything ever written by Richard Feynman. If you don't know who he is, he's a PhD, Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist. So I could tell you those kinds of things, but that's a little bit.
Surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman.
It could be, yes.
I think that's the name of one of his books.
Yeah, they've taken a lot of his talks and published them into books and things like that. A very, very interesting guy. Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist who somehow in his own mind can rectify the huge variance between science and religion, and at the same time play bongo drums in bars, so on the weekends. And he's dead now, but anyway, super interesting guy. I like reading stuff about people like that are kind of out there and trying to understand their mind and how they came to where they're at.
Love it. Thanks for the shares there. Great stuff. Love Scaling Up and Scale. And the thing that I took away from Richard Feynman and everything I've read by him is I think he would carry a dozen questions with him at all times of things that he was pondering. And like if he was studying something in physics, he said, actually, the principles here might help him in another area of his life. And I thought that's an amazing exercise. And I started a dozen questions and then lost them. But and great recommendation.
Let me throw out my favorite quote at the moment. It's by Albert Einstein. If you always do what you always did, you will always get what you always got. Kind of relevant to what we're talking about here. Innovation is the way out. You got to really think, you got to think innovative and you got to change. I mean, this world's not standing still, right? AI, all stuff going on, right? There's lots of stuff going on. You have to think about what is it that I could change so I can get a different result.
Perfect conclusion there, Bob. Thank you so much for doing this and everything that you're doing for Private Practice PT. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chad. Same to you. You guys are amazing at Breakthrough and helping practices just scale and grow and be relevant. And I believe we are the heart and soul of physical therapy, private practice owners. So let's stay in the game and keep evolving.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay. Thanks, Chad.
Remember to visit getbreakthrough.com to access our free resource library designed specifically for private practice growth. While you're there, make sure you register for a complimentary growth assessment to learn about potential opportunities for growth in your local market. Again, thank you for tuning into the Grow Your Practice podcast and supporting our mission to help people in pain get back to normal naturally.